The presenter actually traces this whole airspace denial back to a recent UN assembly. A Saudi representative got up and emphasized the need to respect all nations' sovereignty. Now, to most of us, that probably just sounds like standard diplomatic boilerplate, right? But the presenter interprets this as a coded, direct defense of Iranian airspace. They're basically saying Saudi Arabia is actively shielding its neighbor from U.S. intervention.
You might be wondering why the sudden resistance. Well, the source points to two massive factors. First up, personal pride. They cite a past, somewhat dismissive comment from Donald Trump, the infamous KISS comment, that allegedly really awakened Crown Prince Mohammed bin Salman's pushback against Washington. Second, just hard, cold military reality. The source points to a 40-day conflict where Iran allegedly struck the Prince Sultan Air Base, literally destroying U.S. KC-135 refueling planes. Seeing that kind of American vulnerability firsthand is what the presenter claims finally pushed the Saudis away.
Which brings us to Section 2, the history of the petrodollar.
To understand where the presenter thinks the future is heading, we've got to rewind a bit to 1974 to define the petrodollar. Imagine for a second if you had to buy a basic necessity, like say your weekly groceries, exclusively using foreign gold. That is essentially this system, but for global petroleum. You want oil? You need US dollars. It's that simple. And the presenter highly criticizes this, claiming it essentially enslaved global economies to American paper.
In fact, the presenter frames King Faisal's 1974 decision to link oil to the dollar as this massive historical error for the Middle East. See, at the time, the US dollar was sinking. Tying it to oil effectively threw the American economy a life raft and directly propelled the US to its unchallenged superpower status. But, and this is crucial for their argument, the presenter insists that era is finally coming to an end.
Okay, moving right along to Section 3, the shift to the petro-yuan.
So the argument here is that OPEC is actively fracturing right before our eyes. With the UAE recently stepping away, the presenter says the pressure on Saudi Arabia to stick with the US dollar has just vanished. Without it, the source predicts a massive, tectonic realignment. We're talking about Saudi Arabia and Iran shifting their oil sales to the Chinese yuan, while Russia leans entirely on the ruble.
And if you're thinking, okay, but is this actually happening or is it just some futuristic theory? The presenter points straight to India. India is already purchasing Chinese yuan for the explicit, specific purpose of buying Iranian petroleum. For the source, this is absolute proof. The mechanics of a brand new petro-yuan world order are already humming along, completely bypassing the US dollar.
This sets up Section 4 perfectly. America versus China.
Here's where the presenter draws a really fascinating contrast in how these superpowers strategize. Take Venezuela, for example. The source argues China only cared about oil extraction there. They didn't build up any defenses, making it super easy for the US to step in and pressure Nicolas Maduro. But China learned from that mistake. When they moved into Iran, they didn't just take oil, they transferred deep defense technology, essentially throwing a high-tech shield around the entire country. The presenter's conclusion here? American military might in Iranian airspace is now completely neutralized.
Taking that lesson, the source outlines what they see as China's ultimate endgame. By pulling Saudi Arabia away from the US and aligning them closely with Iran, China isn't just securing cheap energy for themselves, they are moving to fully control the Strait of Hormuz. The source concludes that China is methodically, almost like a game of chess, checkmating the US out of the Middle East entirely.
And finally, we hit Section 5, the future and prophecies.
Now hang on, because this is where the presentation takes a truly unexpected dramatic pivot. The host basically abandons economics entirely and starts framing all of these geopolitical shifts through the lens of Islamic end times prophecy. They claim, with absolute certainty, that the Middle East is the destined stage for the world's final battles. They state that the prophesied figure, Imam Mahdi, will draw support from this specific region. The Antichrist, or Dajjal, will emerge here, and Jesus will literally return here to defeat him. For the presenter, Saudi Arabia rejecting U.S. airspace isn't just statecraft anymore. It is a divine, inevitable step toward these final apocalyptic battles.
And that ultimately brings us to our core takeaway today. When we analyze global media, we really have to ask ourselves, how do deeply ingrained religious prophecies shape the way modern geopolitics are actually understood by regional audiences? For many people watching these events unfold, fluctuating currencies and air-based strikes aren't just the evening news. They are the literal unfolding of ancient texts.
So, if we ignore that lens, are we missing the real story of how global alliances are being reshaped today? Thanks so much for joining me on this explainer, and remember to always keep questioning the narratives behind the headlines.